Hi, I'm Julia Brennan, Director of Local Government, Housing and Communities here at Transform.
And I'm David Beach. I'm a former local government officer who works particularly in London boroughs.
And we've known each other for a very long time. I think we first worked together at a London borough putting in a large selective licensing scheme.
It seems a long while ago, but yeah, back in 2015.
Was it 15? What? I'd like to get your overall take on the new renters' rights legislation.
Yeah, really, it's the biggest change to the regulation of privately rented homes in over 40 years. It's been a long time in the pipeline. It was first mooted maybe 6 or 7 years ago, but it's finally hit the statute books last year. And it's obviously got implications for a number of key stakeholders. From a tenant's point of view, it provides much needed security and stability. There are lots of measures in the Act which are there to provide tenants with a better experience. Unfortunately, private renting is not necessarily the tenure of choice still for many tenants. So there are key provisions in there about landlords would have to have a reason to get possession of their property. And there are also restrictions on how a landlord can increase rent, so not complete rent controls, but certain restrictions on that. From a landlord's perspective, there are clearly obligations on landlords to manage and maintain their properties to a higher standard. And from a local authority, local council perspective, there are lots of duties contained within the new Act which they will be responsible for enforcing.
Do you think it's a good thing?
Yes.
So what do you think the new challenges then are for local councils in implementing this legislation?
So I think one of the key challenges really stems from the fact that unlike probably previous legislation, there is a very clear expectation and duty on local authorities to enforce the new laws. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but it is framed in a different way, and that the Act makes it clear that enforce means either issuing a civil penalty or taking prosecution proceedings, and that's very much a break with what's happened in the past. So, you know, there's lots of challenges around local authorities being prepared and ready to, because that is a different mindset and a different approach. Lots of the new areas where new laws are in place won't necessarily fall to teams that traditionally are familiar with enforcement.
Trading standards, for example.
So trading standards or process housing departments. There's obviously lots of new laws in there which relate to tenancy issues, which might be for housing departments or homelessness sections. So, you know, the initial challenge will be which sections and which officers are actually going to be enforcing this new legislation. What's the capacity of those teams? Are the teams trained?
That's something that Transform are working on at the moment, is helping local authorities to collaborate across those different services, bringing people together and putting in those processes and governance so that they can do exactly that, understand who is enforcing which bit of the legislation, how does the journey for those different services look.
And I think it's also worth reflecting that some councils, it's fair to say, are more active at the moment than others in terms of enforcement, and particularly those who do have large-scale licensing schemes tend to be more active enforcement-wise. But I think what I would say there is even those authorities that have got that increased experience are still going to have significant challenges with getting to grips with the volume of new laws which they're going to have to enforce.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, do you think councils are taking on new officers in order to deal with renters' rights, or will they have to sort of find capacity from the existing staff?
So I think there's obviously challenges around things like qualified environmental health officers. That's always been a challenge, and I think that challenge will be more acute as time goes on. So I do think local authorities are going to have a more flexible approach to that and look at other officers who can, as I said before, there will also be teams who haven't traditionally done enforcement, such as in the housing homelessness section. So I think authorities will have to look at different approaches. Certainly I've worked with authorities before where we haven't had environmental health officers, but we've had other enforcement officers, and they've been trained up to do enforcement work. They've had the opportunity from a career point of view to do environmental health qualifications and that kind of thing. So I think resourcing will be a challenge, and that resourcing is not only around the frontline teams that will evidence the breaches and the offences, but also like legal services. There'll be if you take, the more enforcement action you take, the more work that will generate, and that will obviously generate work for legal services as well, really. So it's not just in the frontline enforcement teams.
So that speaks really well to the work that we're starting to do, helping local authorities to prepare for this. For example, helping them to develop operating models that actually reflect the needs across those different teams and those different services. What other things do you think councils can be doing to support the rollout of this legislation? Yeah,
so it's a combination of some specific things and some more general things. So I think specifically it's absolutely essential that councils have a completely new and updated enforcement policy in place. There is proper governance over that. There's also, as I say, a very different emphasis on the new legislation. I think quite lots of local authority enforcement policies have traditionally been couched in terms of a stage approach to enforcement, and enforcement as a last resort. Yeah. That's very much not the mood music with this new legislation. So I think the enforcement policy, as well as reflecting the new offences and breaches, will also have to be consistent with the language of that new act. I think it's important that local authorities build upon relationships with other partner organisations and also with other local authorities. There are provisions in the Act for local authorities to take action in respect of properties which aren't actually in their area or in neighbouring areas. So it's obviously really important with those kind of cases that those kind of pre-existing relationships exist, and there's a mutual understanding about how that might work. It's also important probably on that regard that people's enforcement policies are broadly consistent, because the idea is if you take action against a property in a neighbouring area, you impose the penalty for your own authority, not the property where the property actually sits. So there is important to be consistency there. Comms is really important as well, for a whole range of stakeholders, really. So I think tenants have been aware of what the new rules are, who they can go to if they have problems, and certainly with landlords, a range of levels, really. Obviously, there's obviously the kind of enforcement regulatory angle where you're trying to prevent landlords doing things which are not legal by ensuring that they're aware of that. But I think there's also concerns from landlords out there, and there is some evidence in some areas that landlords are leaving the market because there's almost like myths that once the Renters' Rights Act comes in, they'll never be able to get their property back and so on. So I think absolutely clear, landlords provide a really valuable, important source of relatively low cost accommodation for residents, and councils want to work with landlords and maintain that supply of good quality rented accommodation. Yeah,
so Transform are helping quite a lot of councils with the comms. As you said, in particular around external landlord comms and for tenants. Partly, I think that really helps councils because it means that they perhaps don't need to enforce as much if landlords know what they need to do, and it sort of nips it in the bud.
There's always an argument in a way if a local authority has to enforce, it's a failure really, because you haven't been able to achieve compliance voluntarily, or you haven't been able to avoid that breach or that transgression. So there'll always be a need for enforcement, but if there can be good engagement with landlords and that can drive compliance before the legislation comes in, then that's obviously good for everybody. I suppose just making the point that the successful preparedness and implementation of the Renters' Rights Act from a local authority perspective, it's more of a whole organisation response to it. It shouldn't just be seen as a certain frontline services like the process housing, the licensing team and trading standards. It's important that legal are very much involved because of the support for appeals and so on that go through the legal process, that finance are heavily involved in terms of any additional resourcing that's needed as well, really. and the other sections of the council that might come across those issues and evidence those issues and know what the referral pathways are, so that that the information and data gets to the right team to be able to enforce.
So it kind of goes back to that target operating model, making sure the right teams are covering the right bits of the legislation.
Yeah, I think knowing how local authorities work, I think it does need a senior manager to be the sponsor, the main champion of that across the organisation, really. And I think having if you have a more junior level officer doing that, you don't necessarily get the necessary buy-in from other teams, really. So I think you probably need obviously structures vary depending on the authority, but probably someone at a director level who is the champion. Exactly.
Yeah. The Renters' Rights Act is a major shift for councils, bringing new responsibilities around enforcement, compliance, and tenant and landlord comms. It demands confident, coordinated responses. At Transform, we help local authorities navigate that change through strong programme governance, service redesign, data readiness, and targeted communications. Our practical, flexible approach ensures that councils can be compliant, operationally ready, and set up to raise standards across the private rented sector.